Oh boy.
Okay, I think we're live. Wow, look at that. Everything seems to be working. Richard's frozen, but he'll be back with us. There he is. So, welcome everybody. Tonight's stream is about one thing and one thing only, and that is gatekeeping in the RPG space. It's been sort of a contentious discussion around several of the live streams. It's resulted in arguments on Twitter, down, not people being blocked and other people cursing other people out. So, hopefully, we can avoid all that. But before we get started, I want to introduce everybody. We'll start with the fine folks from Wick TV who kind of instigated this whole thing. Do you want to go ahead and
Oh, sure.
introduce
Yeah.
yourself?
Okay. Well, yeah. Name's Wick. I host a channel on YouTube and Twitch called Wick TV where we talk about political issues, cultural issues, and recently I've been doing a lot more in the hobby space and the gaming streams and things like that. And yeah, that's me. I'm just here to stand gatekeeping. I think gatekeeping is good, but we'll get into it when we get into it.
Yeah, we'll get there in a minute. Harmony, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Harmony Ginger. I am on Twitter and YouTube as I think Twitter I'm at Ginger Blast. On YouTube I'm Harmony_Ginger. I'm just a Twitter person, and yeah, no, I just started YouTube recently, but I've been on a lot of these shows, and I've been on Quick's channel some, and I think I've debated gatekeeping. Have we talked about gatekeeping? I can't remember.
Not directly. That wasn't
Okay.
ever the. Yeah.
Ah, okay. So apparently I haven't talked about this before. I have been gatekept though.
Okay.
That's my qualification.
All right. Richard, you want to say hi to everybody and tell them who you are? Probably the better known person here anyway. So let's just
yeah, and the least people want to know. Yeah, I worked on Magic: The Gathering and D&D for a bunch of years. Now I just draw my own stuff and hang out with my dog. That's pretty much what I do.
Winston. All right.
Yep.
So this sort of whole topic came up to my attention for a couple of reasons. One is I've been playing since the early 80s, and it's kind of interesting to me that people were now trying to keep people out of Dungeons and Dragons and RPGs when we used to have to go like drag them in and like say, please come try it, right? See, please come play, because nobody would. Because you had the Satanic Panic, you had nobody's mother liked it because there was a big picture of a devil on the front cover of one of the books, and that's just evil. So there was a time and a place where we had to like yank people in. And now we're kind of like, oh no, you two can come in, you two stay out. Now we're trying to pick and choose. And to me, gatekeeping is deciding. I just put it in the chat, right? Yeah, I looked it up. Let's look at dictionary.com. It's the activity of controlling and usually limiting general access to something, which to me in a hobby space seems kind of silly. So some people are going to say, well, yeah, but what if people come in and change it? Well, okay, but what if they don't, right? What if you can explain to them the way most people play it, convince them that's the right way to do it, and say, okay, here's the hobby that we've all known to kind of love, and bring more people in. If by gatekeeping you mean, only let people in who might not possibly ever change it, that's a whole other thing, right? So I wanted to at least work from one standard definition. So part of the problem people have with me, and at least my kids will tell everybody, is before I went to college, I was in the Army. Then I went and got a PhD in physics, which makes me very stubborn and very hard to intimidate, right? So because when you're an enlisted soldier, you have drill sergeants, and you kind of learn to laugh at them after a while. So you always have platoon sergeants, first sergeants, command sergeant, major, somebody coming along to scream at you for something. And then after that, I wound up with the PhD, and next thing you know, I'm actually the smart guy who's hard to intimidate. Even though the little letters after your main name do not actually denote smart, they just mean I went to college for a really long time. But we'll leave all that part out of this. So to me, gatekeeping is sort of a bad thing for the hobby space. And I get why people want to do it, because they fear the thing they love changing. The one thing I can agree with, and Harmony and I were trading messages about this at one point. I don't even know if you remember Harmony, but it was on Twitter one day. I agree with keep gatekeeping at my table, because there are certain people I just don't want to spend any time with. And those are people that are going to go play an RPG and bring modern day politics and modern day discussions, and it's going to not be about the RPG. It's going to be about something else. And gatekeeping at a table, I can kind of get along with, because there's some people you just don't want to sit down and play with a game for hours. Gatekeeping an entire hobby, I mean, that just seems kind of really hard to do and really weird. So I thought I'd get everybody's take on what they mean about gatekeeping, and then we'll go from there. So why don't we start with Wick TV? Wick, why don't you take us away?
So I will say that 100% gatekeeping at the table is very important, and I think that's where the strictest gatekeeping should be. But I do not think it should stop there. I think there are very good reasons to gatekeep the hobby, not from individuals, but from ideas. And let me tell you what I mean by this, okay? Let me kind of explain myself here. I think that if you have a game that you enjoy that is played in a certain way, or this kind of style of game, and you have a bunch of people coming in that want to say, hey, Magic the Gathering as a card game is great and all, but wouldn't it be nice if we made it, I don't know, if we added some dice and maybe made it a video game too, and maybe did all these things with it? I think that allowing those ideas in unchecked and allowing people that want to rearrange the furniture in your house like that to come into your hobby is a threat to the hobby. I think that I like Dungeons and Dragons, right? I like the tabletop role playing within a certain set of parameters. And if it ceases to be within those parameters, I will cease to have a hobby. So unless I am able to advocate and gatekeep certain ideas out of the hobby, then my hobby is at risk. And so that's what I advocate for. There are certain ideas that I think that can be within the bounds that we can debate and discuss, and different flavors of ice cream, right? But if someone wants to add spaghetti to my ice cream, I'm just going to gatekeep you out. That's my thoughts.
I think we can all agree with spaghetti and ice cream, because that's just weird.
Yeah.
But let's go, Harmony. Why don't you go next, and then we'll get to Richard. Leave him for.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think there's a distinction between gatekeeping hobbies and communities. First of all, I don't know how you gatekeep a hobby. I don't know how you tell people that they can't join a hobby, because a hobby doesn't necessitate a small community, if that makes sense. They can start their own community within the hobby. I'm not really certain the mechanics of keeping people out of a hobby. I don't know that works. I think people can join a hobby if they want to, and there's not much anyone can do to keep them out. But I do agree with gatekeeping communities, like game groups, small communities. I think that I think you need to filter who comes in and who doesn't in those, or your community will fall apart. Like, I think many of us have seen groups fall apart when you get one problem player in. You have to pick between the problem player, like, do we accommodate him or do we keep a healthy group? I mean, that happens all the time. I think generally gatekeeping, when applied in small communities, is a good thing. I've been gatekept from smaller communities, and I think the answer is, if you are gatekept from smaller communities, you are perfectly within your rights. And in fact, I would encourage you to make your own community. I mean, nobody's going to stop you. Nobody can keep you out of doing what you want to do.
It's a good point. So we're going to come back to something that Wick said in a minute, but Richard, I want to give you your couple of minutes to chime in here if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, I think so. Like I'm seeing a couple different levels here. So the first one is sort of, I think, talking about your own group, or groups that you play with, groups that you want to run games for yourself. And on that level, I think typically, most people are like, yeah, you're welcome to come to my game. But like I said, if somebody is not enjoying the game, not enjoying the style of the game, or they're being kind of a jerk at the table or whatever, then yeah, it's like, well, we don't want them in the game anymore. So there's this level of that. There's the other level, I think, which I think to me is almost like a descriptor of the style of game you're playing. So there used to be a style of D&D that would be played at tournaments a lot that we would call the meat grinder, right? Where you would just make characters and you'd try to run them through and see how many survived. Now, a lot of people would say, I don't find that fun, and that's fine. So to me, it's sort of like, I think the more we get into the idea of saying, like, here are different play styles. Here are different things that we like. Here's the way we want to do it. I don't necessarily see it as gatekeeping. I just see it the same as, if you walk into a video store and there's no video stores anymore. I know that. But if you walked into a video store back in the ancient times that me and Tim are from,
the before time, yeah,
the before time, there would be like a section for drama and a section for like sci-fi and a section for comedy, and what you're in the mood for is what you do. And that to me is another thing. You may be in the mood for a meat grinder. You may be in the mood for like a big long plotted game, this kind of thing. You may be in the mood just for a dungeon crawl. So to me, I do think it is, if someone like if the intent is sort of like they're running a dungeon crawl, but I don't want them to run a dungeon crawl. It's like, well, don't do that. Let them do what they're doing, and you do what you're doing.
That's well said. So Wiki said something interesting, and it reminded me of something that Harmony I heard on your channel the other night with somebody else. That well, what if it becomes a video game? What if it becomes something else? And I think the thing that was brought up on your channel was, what if it becomes this IP where we're trying to do movies and streaming shows, and it ceases to be as much a game? Just because it becomes a video game doesn't mean that the game itself goes away. Right. It doesn't mean that Magic is gone. Right. If it turns into Magic, Magic Go, it's because there's Monopoly Go, Hasbro's making a ton of money at. If we turn it into Dungeons and Dragons Go or something, that doesn't mean that Magic or Dungeons and Dragons ceases to be. That just means that there's another way to go enjoy that particular hobby, and maybe it's not for you, but maybe it's for somebody else. So I don't understand why keeping those things out is a problem. And Harmony, it came up on your channel. As a movie. It's like, somebody was discussing, I don't want it to turn into an IP where we're worried about movies and this and that. It would have never been that way. Yet in 1982, Gary was off in Hollywood trying to figure out how to make it a movie in the first place, right? So to me, it seems like, fearing the unknown, fearing what might change, fearing a new way to enjoy it, it seems kind of counterintuitive to me. It's like, I enjoy playing Monopoly with my kids, right? I have gatekept, and I'll use that term, a person I used to work with when I used to do adult game nights at my house. Somebody who would come over to play Monopoly, and a grown adult, if he wasn't winning, would flip the board. It was annoying. So he didn't get to come back and play anymore. But I enjoy playing those games with my kids. I also happen to enjoy Monopoly Go. There's no reason that Monopoly Go is going to make the game of Monopoly less enjoyable when I sit down to play it. And if they did a video game version of Magic, I don't understand how that would be a bad thing.
So
I don't. Harmony, go ahead.
Can I respond to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that was probably on Quick's channel and not my channel, because to the best of my recollection, I don't know that we had that discussion on my channel. Mm-hmm. But I would say that stuff in a microcosm is not necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But the problem I see is when this stuff is expanding outwards while the core of the hobby is running into some major problems, then I start to be concerned about it. For example, if they're just making a D&D movie, that's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with that. If they are making a movie and expanding out to a bunch of merchandise at the same time as the books they are releasing are going down in quality, that I see as a problem. Now, if the books are high quality and they still have a thriving scene, and there isn't bad things happening in the scene, like major bad things, like we're losing the quality of the core products. That's my problem. Mm-hmm. So if the quality of the core products are high, then I don't have an issue with any of that stuff. But if this stuff is happening at the same time where the quality is declining, then that becomes an issue.
If I may,
mm-hmm.
I have a slightly different angle on this than Harmony does. I would say that Harmony brings up a great point. That's also a concern. But when the official product changes, right, in a way that you don't like, it makes it harder for you to find people to play with. And yes, I understand that something changing or becoming something different or having new ways to interact with it doesn't make the old go away, especially when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons. I still have my 2 ebooks, my 1 ebook, right? I still have all these things. I could still use all those things. However, they are no longer officially supported. And I think that matters. And I think that when we see official support and the flagship be something like 5th edition or what are they calling the new one they're coming out with? I don't know.
One D&D or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. That is what people will think of. That is what people will learn as D&D, and it becomes much harder to interact. The language changes, and it becomes harder to communicate even, right? There's a lot of things that get lost, and I think that is a concern because at the end of the day, and I'll just finish up with this, at the end of the day, there are certain things that would, as I said in my opening statement, expand it past the bounds where I find enjoyable, and if that becomes the focus, I lose out. I just do. And that's why I'm very like, hey, we can't I don't want these changes. I'm going to advocate against these changes. And to talk to Harmony about how to gatekeep ideas out, it's by being very strict with saying, oh, you're not actually playing D&D, right? Like just keeping the terms very defined and being just frank and saying, yeah, that's a fun game. That sounds cool, but that's not Dungeons and Dragons. We can't call it that.
Well, I mean, okay, I hear what you're saying, but let me put my little other hat on for a minute. I learned early on that was, first edition red. I wasn't quite the original edition. I was the red book was the first one I had, and it's still sitting here. We touch it carefully now because it's falling apart because it's been used for so many years. But I first learned on red book and first edition years and years ago. And I play in a first edition game on Tuesday nights over on Dungeon Delvers channel. It's a lot of fun, but I play 5th edition with my kids, not because I'm like, oh, I must have 5th edition and first edition in my life. My kids have zero interest in first edition because those game mechanics are a little bit different, and they grew up at a different time than I did, right? So they like 5th edition better. They've read through those 5th edition books, and when I show them first edition, they just have no interest. Now they're 11, 13 and I had to think for a second. They're 11, 13, and 14. So they're age different. They're a much different age than anybody here. But also I think the way they are written is for a different audience than like for my age group, right? So my age group and my background are much different. And, I'm older than anybody here except Richard. And I'm going to contend that you and I are the same age, and I don't even know the truth to that. We'll just stick with it. It's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Harmony is obviously the youngest one here at 21. Thank you for smiling. I was looking for that. I was trying to make you laugh. I don't know. But my point is that I think those changes might not necessarily be changes for the sake of changes. They might be changes for the sake of people just look at things differently now than they did back in '82 when I first started playing. And actually, even if you look at like 5th edition, which is decidedly a different game than first, and I've been diving into really hard lately, the differences in between them. Richard's been part of that discussion. I've got a whole bunch more lined up. Richard, I'm going to have to send you some notes I did on goblins over the years just to get your take on it because you're the goblin guy. But the point is that I don't think necessarily all changes are bad. Yes, 5th edition is rule lawyery in a way that first and second wasn't. It kind of takes some freedom away from DMs. It does take some attacks out, like with the owlbear, it no longer has a hug attack for some reason. But that doesn't mean you can't still use those characters from the first one and kind of slide them into 5th. Some people don't like Thaco. Okay, I get it. Some people don't like the fact that you get so many saving throws. Kind of get that. But Hasbro wouldn't have done that. Wizards of the Coast wouldn't have done that without some kind of information in their back pocket that said this is going to help us sell more games and get more people in that hobby. So I don't think changes for the sake of changes happen. I think changes happen to maybe expand that audience a bit. And if you look at first versus 5th, there's some differences, but they're not gargantuan differences, right? They're not, Thaco's different and the saving throws are different, but they're not like, it's not Dungeons and Dragons and now all of a sudden, it's like you go from a Ferrari to a Ford. It's not that, right? It's like one level of automobile inside the same manufacturing line as another. It's just a little bit different version of it. So I think sometimes we fear change and we might not necessarily want to fear change before it occurs. Is my point.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
How many recent Wizards books have you read
Uh,
in the past 3 years? Past 3 years,
oh,
post
half
Splashes.
half a dozen at least.
Half a dozen?
Yeah.
Okay. And you haven't seen a decline in quality?
I've seen a decline in what it depends on how you. In certain ways, they are different. I don't think the overall quality of the book is different. I would like to see a little bit more attention paid to cover art than they used to pay.
I'm
And
not
part of
talking about art.
Yeah, are
but
the adventures?
but part
Let's
of it.
look at-
Hang on a second. Let me get to that. Let me finish answering this question because I think I'm going to address that adventure thing.
Okay.
Part of it also, you have to remember when TSR was TSR and some of those early adventures came out, the company was very small and you had groups of 5 or 6 working very hard to build something and play something. Right now, when you get to the Hasbro Wizards of the Coast level, and I'd love to have Richard's take on this, you no longer have a team of 5 or 6. You have a team of 5 or 6 with 3 committees they have to go through. So yes, you do get a slightly watered down version of it, but it's by the nature of the beast that the company has become successful and the hobby has become successful and expanded. And now that it's bigger, it just has a different way of keeping the company flowing. And since Richard's actually worked at Wizards of the Coast, and none of us have, I'd love to get his take on that before we go any further.
Well, I think Harmony hits a good point because the quality has obviously gone down since I've left.
Heyo.
I also don't know. I also don't know which books. I don't. Also, honestly, I would have to go look at the dates on the books I've read and when they actually came out. I know they're 5th edition, but I don't know that they're the brand new ones. So I would have to go look at that to be honest.
Yeah, I'm talking in the last 3 years. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm only kidding. That was only a joke.
No, he's not kidding. Right.
But having I would definitely say that like there was a thing I used to talk about on Magic when I was working on Magic the Gathering. When I came board on Magic, Magic was actually kind of trending down, and then over a few years, we brought it way up. And as a brand in a corporation starts climbing that hill, you draw more of the Eye of Sauron and the upstairs ideas, right? and all the other things that come with it, where it's like, oh, here's other things we should do. Here's the, so, like I would say just broadly, that sort of thing. Like when you get one of the things I think that can destroy a lot of things is actually success. Like if you get big success, then it'll just start ripping you apart. The team didn't substantially grow. Like we grew a good bit while I was there, but there was definitely a lot more of essentially on the brands I was on. When they really start knocking it out of the park, the sort of, I guess, editorial suggestions from above start coming in a lot more, and they can almost be like dictates. And that to me is sort of, I always tried to hold my ground the best I could on that stuff, because it was sort of like, hey, we're the jungle guides who got you here, right? like we led you this far, cut the jungle for you. So if you want to go further into the jungle, we're probably good people to help you do that.
Can I ask you a question, Richard, if I may? Sure. So, in your experience, when you were getting these messages from on high, these dictations from on high, when Soren was speaking to you, right? Do you think that their suggestions or editorial suggestions and things, do you think it made the game, the hobby that you were working on, did you think it was a positive or a negative impact overall? Just
it's very much when you start having a thing like I get into. Obviously, I got into D&D like everybody else. I just loved playing it. When I started working on D&D, I was like, "This is wonderful because I can just make stuff up." There's this real gradual, I would say, divide that happens where you start also realizing that you have a business, right? And I think you have the choice at that point of on which topics do you think like a customer, and at which I'm a fan, and in which topics do you think, like, okay, we have to run a business here? And those to me are, that is the tightrope. If you choose one over the other in the wrong spot, if I kind of say like, like we should just do this for the business, and it's like, yeah, but if I'm talking to you as a fan, that sucks, right? like it's like that is actually also bad for business, right? like, so to me, that's the tightrope, and that's sort of the tug of war that happens, I think, and it's really tough. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that would. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Mostly, yes. I
Mhm.
guess I guess the reason I ask, right, and kind of what I'm trying to suss out here
Yep.
is how much because Timothy, you've said this a few times too, that I've read in tweets and I've seen you in people's chats say this, and I've heard you say this, right? That they want to expand the hobby by reaching to a wider audience, and it has to be successful business wise. And one of my concerns here is that by appealing to the wider audience, that it's going to lose a lot of the things that made it special to me, right? As a fan, in order to appeal to a larger audience who wouldn't normally like the hobby, in order to drag those people in or try to get them to purchase the product, they are either going to change or stop producing content, which drew me in initially, which did not draw them in. Does that make sense?
It does, but let me put my, I've been, so let me look at this from a corporate perspective by itself. And for that, I have to go on a look at 30-second, about Tim moment. And I apologize for anybody. You might need caffeine for this. So after I got my PhD, I worked at a very large university, which was basically like a mega corporation, right? And then I actually went to a publicly traded company. At publicly traded companies, you have sort of a double-edged sword of problems. You want things to grow such that you keep up with the company growth rate, but unless you want a lot of attention, you don't want to grow faster than the company growth rate, but you also don't want to grow slower than the company growth rate, right? And I was in the defense and aerospace sector, and the one project I was working on was 1/3 of a multi-billion-dollar company's revenue at one point. Right. So imagine that, 1/3 of a multi-billion-dollar company is the stuff you're working on. And I was in a reasonable enough position that I had CEO access. Now, the reason I bring that up is you almost never want to be the reason the stock, you absolutely never for your career want to be the reason the stock price goes down. Okay. So if you try to say, oh, look, we're going to stay for this little area, we're not going to grow, and Hasbro ends up growing and you don't grow accordingly, your budgets decline. You're not going to get to hire new artists. You're not going to get attention. You're not going to get PR. You're not going to get advertising. You're not going to get the resources you need inside the company to do the job you want to do. So you have to keep pace with the company growth rate. And Dungeons & Dragons at one point, I think especially during the pandemic, was beating Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast average growth rate. It was probably well above it for most of their games or most of their product lines, which is sort of that zone you almost don't want to be in, because then the higher ups are like, oh, great, you grew at 15, 16%. Do that again, right? Here's a bunch of resources, grow faster, right? And they want you to keep up that success. That means the only solution you have is you become sort of a victim of your own success. You have to cast a wider net, because you're not going to sell Tim additional, 15% more books next year. You're probably not going to sell Harmony 15% more books this year versus last year. You got to go find new customers. And there's only one way to do that, right? So it becomes sort of a victim of its own success. So you either need to keep it small, in which case you run the risk of Hasbro completely ignoring it, not doing anything, or you sort of keep pace. But I think it's kind of become this sort of weird nebulous zone where, because of two things, and I'm going to say, everybody says it's COVID. I think COVID was one of the reasons it came back strongly, but I also think Stranger Things had a lot to do with that, because Stranger Things kind of made it cool again. So those two things combined sort of at the same time to really boost the crap out of it. And all of a sudden, tons of people are playing again, and tons of people are talking about it again. And that wasn't true for a whole lot of years. So I think it drove that growth rate, and then they have to go find new ways to continue that growth rate. And the only way to do it is to go find new customers. So unless, everybody's willing to go off and start buying more books within the same customer set, you're going to have to go find new ones.
But is that good for the hobby?
Well, it's the situation we have, right? I mean, you have to live with the world you've got, not the one you want to craft, right? Because Hasbro's Wizards of the Coast is not going to sell Dungeons and Dragons to anybody. That's not going to happen. They're not going to sell Magic the Gathering to somebody. Right? You'd have to be a gargantuan player to come in and kind of wrestle those two loose. And I don't know that anybody big enough would do that. So is it good for the hobby? I don't know. I think it's good to have more choices to play, especially in the RPG space, because, first edition, second edition, third edition, fifth edition. Notice I will not ever mention fourth because even I don't like that one. But first, second, third, and fifth, I think it certainly they're different, but they've never gone away. Drive-through RPG is still there. If you like first, it's still out there. There's still a bunch of indies that are publishing stuff in that space. So is it good or bad for the hobby? I think overall it's probably a good thing, because if you get a fifth edition player, so let's say for this, let's game this out in my head. So let's say you get a fifth edition player like my 14-year-old son who really starts to enjoy it. What are the odds 5 years from now he's going to go, hey, let me go take a look at that first edition stuff. Maybe you can get a convert. But if you can't get him straight into first, maybe using fifth as a gateway drug to pull him into the stuff we really like is a good idea.
Can I address something that Richard said? Because I think
Absolutely.
it was a really good point. Right.
Absolutely.
So first of all, my problem isn't necessarily that they're appealing to a wider audience. My problem is that they're appealing to a wider audience while letting the quality of their core product slip. And I think it is slipping. And I think saying that quality is not slipping is... I won't go there, but anyway, I think that
if you have a book you want me to read, I will gladly do it. If you think it's one that's got poor quality in it, I'll gladly happy.
Radiant Citadel, I think, is a very poor quality book. I think, there are others too. I think, I haven't read the deck one, but I think Wild Beyond the Witchlight was a poor quality adventure. I think. There are others here too that I think Rime of the Frost Maiden could have been a better adventure. I think a lot of the ones on the tail end of 5e that we're seeing were not high quality adventures. Now, I think Tasha's Cauldron of Everything was not a high quality book. I think those are the ones I've read here on the tail end of 5e. I probably have read another one that I can't think of. But anyway, I think that a lot of franchises over time, you see the same pattern. And I think that while these franchises are in the hands of their original developers, you have people who are knowledgeable and passionate about the product working on it. And I think when it gets passed down to the first generation, then the product quality is still usually pretty high, because these first generation people that come in and inherit the product tend to be fans of the original product. But I think over time, generation after generation, you start to see a slip in the quality, right? Because you have people who work on them who cannot articulate why the original text, why the original product was so good and spoke to people. I think you see that in Star Wars. I think you see that in Lord of the Rings. I think you are seeing that in Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's a very broad pattern that happens over a variety of franchises. And I think that the people who are currently working on Dungeons and Dragons, some of them, not all of them, but some of them do not understand why the original was good.
Yep.
And I think that is just a very broad pattern.
There's a thing I noticed too, which is very tricky. And I've tried to talk this through with a few people, and I think I've kind of come to a certain place with it. But it seems like there's kind of a couple ways to go with creative stuff. You can look at it and be like, I'm going to defy the tropes, right? Like, I'm going to go against the tropes. I'm going to go against the typical. But to me, there's actually the other portion of that, which is, a good chef can have the exact same ingredients as any other chef. They will make the best food because of their talent at being a chef, right? So it's like, I don't need to say my salad doesn't need vegetables, right? to defy do you know what I mean? Like that, if you're actually a good chef, you can be like, okay, well, these are the typical things, but whether it's in the way I present it or the way I put it together or what spices I put on it, I can make a good meal out of that. I don't have to say steak doesn't need meat, right? Can we defy the thing. So I found that as a very common thing, like throw out things that work. And Tim, as a person who's a physicist and has designed things, I would say, I would compare it to you. If you were starting to design a rocket, you would probably look at all of the rockets that worked properly, and not say those worked, but let's throw that out. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
you do that on any science or engineering project, right?
yeah,
It you don't ever say, "Oh, let's just ignore everything that came before us." Even when you're running a social media channel, right? You don't go off and say, "Ooh, I'm going to reinvent every wheel." You look at it and say, "Hey, look, I'm going to go off and see what's worked before, and maybe I might adapt that in some fashion," right?
yeah.
I mean, let's take an example from the movie industry. An author I know. So I've written a number of fiction books. If anybody's curious, but one book that was written it was released the year I came out, that I think transformed action movies, was a book called First Blood. It's written by a guy named David Morrell. It was his first book ever. It came out in 1972. Became the movie First Blood, which launched the Rambo franchise. Prior to that movie and prior to that book, action books were starting to make a change with Ludlum and a few others, but action movies were sort of 20 minutes of action and an hour and 10 minutes of story. That movie took it another way, where it said, we're going to have 20 minutes of story and an hour and a half of action, right? Or an hour of action. And it launched 80s cinema in a whole new direction. But it's because that one transformed what audiences expected out of an action film. And you can't, it'd be hard to make an argument that said any action director in the 80s and even 90s and partially through today, although we're starting to get more story put back in action movies, didn't watch Rambo and go, that worked really well, right? Let's model after that. And I think you see it in the RPG space, where everybody goes, hey, Dungeons and Dragons did really well. Let's model after that, or you wouldn't get so many that are really close in a lot of ways, right? You get a lot of indies that are like, okay, this just looks like early D&D. And they are, right? And that's fine. That's great, because that model works. And maybe Hasbro is missing that. And I already ordered, while you were talking, Radiant Citadel. It'll be here tomorrow. I'm going to read it, and we'll talk about it on your channel if you want.
I didn't mean to give them money.
Yeah.
Don't do
It's
that, guys.
okay.
Don't do
It's
that.
okay. I assure you, the $24.95 I make is not going to move Hasbro's needle one direction or the other. But the point is that those things really do happen. People do go backwards and look, and I think the indie crowd is still out there. OGL is still out there. So the indie crowd is not going away, right? So if Hasbro continues to ride it off the rails, the indie crowd's going to keep doing stuff. And maybe one of those indies will grow, and as that indie grows, they're going to run into the same problems Hasbro has as they got too big. So, Harmony, I cut you off there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I cut you off. So my problem isn't the expanding audience. My problem is the expanding audience at the same time that the core problem is that the core product is slipping in quality. And I think that it's very important to keep the core product high in quality at all costs, because you are creating fair weather fans is what you're doing. You're creating people who are going to get into your hobby, and they're going to like it until they pick up a book and they realize that your books are not great, and they're not going to stick around if the core product is not high, the quality is not high. That's just
to piggyback off of that too, right? A little bit is that it also is important to make sure that the people who are coming into the hobby actually enjoy the hobby, right? And if they don't really like it, it's a sugar rush. They're not going to stay. You're not going to retain them. And alongside the drop in quality, and an even worse scenario is that the new people coming in, for whatever reason, prefer the low quality product. And then the company's incentivized to continue putting out the slop that they are. And you lose, right? You lose as a former fan, and it's rough. And I understand that we need to make money. It's a business. I get that. But it makes no difference to me, and maybe this is a selfish perspective, but it makes no difference to me if the hobby dies, if it moves away from me. Either way, I've lost my hobby. Either way, I've lost what I want. And so I advocate, and what I'm here to kind of argue is that it's important to keep the ideas, not the individual people, but the ideas of what it means to be D&D clear, put bright lines around it, and just say, hey, this is what it is. There's a saying I like to say, and I think it's very true. D&D is for anyone. It's not for everyone. Not everyone's going to enjoy D&D. They're not. Not everyone likes tabletop RPGs. They don't. But anyone who wants to, who enjoys it, I welcome you. Come on in, play with me. This is what we want to play. But if you want to play, a video game or something, they're over there. More power to you. I don't want to see that. Take it away. But I'm here to play D&D.
Yeah.
That's fair. So since we seem to have worked through that, we've got a couple minutes here because I planned on this taking an hour. I'd love to get everybody's take on VTTs. So one of the big things I think that Hasbro is going to do, or Wizards of the Coast is going to do later this year, is when the new release hits, there's going to be some massive change to their VTT. And I know there's sort of a love-hate relationship with them because at my age, getting a group of people together predictably on a regular basis without some kind of virtual version is almost impossible. I'd love to get people around a table, but it doesn't happen as frequently as I'd want it to. Now VTTs, I've heard people be like, "Oh my God, no, we can't have those because that's not as intended," right? But it's just the reality of the world we live in. So I'll let Harmony, if you'd like to go first. We'll go with ladies first on this one.
I haven't heard the same sentiment about VTTs that you're talking about here, because for most people, I think most people prefer to play in person. I think it's great to play in person. I think in-person games are vastly superior to games on a VTT. However, I have gotten to play with people from across the world on VTTs. I've made new friends on them. I get to play with people that I was friends with before I moved to Florida. I think they're great for allowing us to play D&D, and I think you can play D&D without it. I use it to organize my notes, character sheets, things like that. I think VTTs are a boon to the hobby overall. I haven't seen the same sentiment of people saying that if you're using a VTT, you're not playing real D&D, though I do think the in-person experience is vastly superior in every way. Yeah.
Sadly, I've seen it. I think I just attract a more angry audience than you do, Harmony. I don't know.
Oh, no. No one attracts a more angry audience than me. That's.
I'll fight you for that position, Harmony.
Oh yeah, okay, maybe quick, but there's no way.
Look, I can show you some hit pieces that have been made about me recently. We can go over them, but
that's fair.
Oh no, I have learned to exercise the block button quickly in some cases. It's just so much easier that way.
I have several different communities that I'm a part of that do not like each other. So.
Yeah, like there's a clip of Nicholas Fuentes talking shit about me out there. Okay, so Whoa. Yeah, I got some enemies, but go ahead.
Okay. That's interesting. So one of the things I found the other day was that there was actually a professor at Penn State who has blocked me on Twitter. I haven't interacted with him in 20 years since I was at a university, and I published a paper that completely disproved a paper he had out there. And I found he has actually blocked me on every social media channel there is. I was like, wow, that dude holds a grudge. So Wick, let's get your take on it, and then we'll let Richard, because I'm quite sure the Hasbro version is.
I'm gonna echo a lot of what Harmony just said. I think that it's a necessary evil. I think that it does hurt the hobby, but I think that it would be hurt more without it. Unfortunately, I think playing on a virtual tabletop develops bad habits both for DMs and players, that I fear that if it becomes the norm, right, in the normal way to play, that it will bleed out into my in-person games, and then people have developed bad habits, right, and then we're going to have to train them out of it again. Now, that said, there are people, myself included, there's no one around me currently where I live that plays D&D, really. There's a couple people, right? I don't know very well. We're not very friends. We play different styles of games, and it just wouldn't work out. So if I want to play Dungeons and Dragons, unfortunately, I have to use a virtual tabletop. But I do think that it is something to keep in mind when we discuss, something to keep in mind as we play, that there are some issues with virtual tabletops and using virtual tabletops that we want to mitigate the damage that they do. And also, from a very kind of personal perspective, I'm just worse at messing with the virtual tabletop. And I'm playing at home. I got my minis that I want to use in the box, and I pull them out. What I want to use is quick. It's easy. Boom, bam. I got a system set up. With virtual tabletops, I'm always fiddling with the tech, and it's just slower for me. But that's a skill issue, my part. Anyway, that's my thoughts.
All right, Richard, I'll leave this one with you because I'm going to bet that internal to WotC there were discussions.
Yeah, there were a few. I would say I know my take on it was always sort of like I'll do one of my I'm always using like metaphors and bad comparisons or whatever, but I go to a restaurant and I have cutlery, and that cutlery serves a purpose. And if you start focusing on what can we do with cutlery, like how many different types of cutlery can we have? Can we have different types of plates? Can we shape them different? Can we do all that? Like I'm a little bit. Maybe that's a bad comparison, but what I used to tell them was essentially, if you develop the VTT that goes kind of beyond the sort of simple stuff, which is basically for me when I use a VTT, it's because I have friends I want to play with at a distance. I don't want to screw around with a bunch of fancy pantsy things. I just want to basically be able to talk to my friends, be able to show them a map, be able to move things around on the map, like that really basic stuff. The more you add functionality and try to make it fancier, in my mind, the more you're angling towards now we're competing with bottom of the barrel video games, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like at this point, there's so many things that are automated. There's so many, I have to automate them because it's more complex and all this stuff. And it's like, well, why am I not just playing, a video game? And actually, I could play a good one. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a question, Richard, on that, please?
Sure.
So what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you were worried, and maybe still are, that the tabletop would become what the game is driving into, right? Like we design the game to be easier to play on tabletop rather than the virtual tabletop, I should say, rather than the virtual tabletop being what we feed into the game. Does that make sense? Like that's kind of what I'm hearing your concern be.
Yeah, that's what I guess I'm kind of getting at. Like it's like if you have it's like the really bad version of a Swiss Army knife. Like you have two different products, which is a tabletop game and a video game, right? And I have two different animals, like a panther and a duck. So I'm gonna edge towards this. There's a whole bunch of useless combinations to a panduck. And the truth is they're very different in functionality and how you interact with them. So that in between space, it's like, well, there must be a cool hybrid between panther and duck. And it's like, I'm not convinced, right? You could maybe just invest in a really great video game, or you can invest in a really high quality tabletop game, because those are distinct things. Now, like I said, to me, a lot of VTTs, I've used a few. The ones I tend to prefer are just like, let me get to the game. Let me contact my friends, show them stuff, and pretend that we're sitting around a table together. So for me, the simpler the VTT, the better. So I'm super biased as well.
No, I think you got a good point. There's a very fine line in between when does it stop being a virtual tabletop for a role-playing game and when does it start becoming a video game, right? And those are two completely different worlds. And Wick, what I hear you saying is actually equally well taken, is that if they're difficult to use, who cares? You've just added more complexity to a game that's already fairly complex on occasion. Right? So you got to get a decent user interface. You got to have an easy to use system, and at the same time, you don't want it to be so easy to use that it become more like a video game. So, and I think the other fun one to consider about VTTs is you have to leave it be flexible enough so that anything a player does can happen, right? So if you kind of restrict it and say, here's our map and we decided to do this, and a player decides to do something that VTT has decided isn't possible, right? That becomes a kind of a problem. So you have to really kind of leave it open architecture enough so that just about anything could take place. Otherwise, you don't have those random owlbear attacks that when you least expect it. So you have to leave it open for DM interpretation, I think is what I'm saying. Harmony, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I haven't actually had any situation. I've been using VTTs for several years. I've never had a situation where a limitation in the VTT was limiting for doing what my players wanted to do. However, I will say that the one thing that I am very wary of coming up is Wizards is making their proprietary VTT, and I am very concerned about the monetization scheme that they're going to use on it. My big thing is I do not want microtransactions pushed to my players. So I will not be using the Wizards VTT almost certainly, just because there is I feel that there is a very high potential for that to happen. I think VTT should be responsibly monetized and not pushing microtransactions at every single person that uses it. I think that's a bit much.
I can't speak to what WotC's going to do with it, right? That's up
right.
to them. But I can tell you that I am in the software space. I'm the CTO of a software company now, and we do a lot of tools for people, including some SaaS tools, software as a service tools. Sorry, there's a big pushback from clients in all manner of places about microtransactions. Because microtransactions in games are one thing, and it was fine there. But now the microtransactions have gone from 99 cents to $2.99 to $9.99 to $14.99. And there's beginning to be a huge pushback in the industry from the customer side on these microtransactions. So more and more companies are coming to us going, hey, how do we strip as many microtransactions out as we can? So we've actually looked at some fairly old code on occasion to go out and start to pull those things out. So I'm not saying WotC is so big companies change their minds slowly on things. That's another thing you have to remember. And WotC is part of Hasbro, which is a massive company. So if they've had success with microtransactions, like they have in Monopoly Go, they're very likely to try something like that. Just because those microtransactions have been hugely profitable for them someplace else. They're also very likely, and this is where I think the community can do good things, is if the community bands together and goes on like we did for the Creative Commons license or OGL scandal. If we kind of band together and say, this is not what we want, right? And everybody starts to cancel their subscriptions, they will listen. Right?
Does this count as gatekeeping the hobby?
No, this counts as this does not count as it does not count as gatekeeping the hobby. No. This counts as customer feedback because you're not keeping people out. You're telling the people who produce the game, this sucks.
You're keeping an idea out. You're keeping an idea out. You say, if this idea comes into our hobby, the hobby will be destroyed. We will leave.
I never said it would be destroyed. I just said it would be different.
Well, I'm saying
if you don't use their product, they will make a change. That's what companies do, right? They've got this product. They're not going to abandon it. But if all of a sudden half their user base disappears, they're going to make a shift.
No, I understand they're going to make a shift in the things, but I would argue, right? And I know you disagree with me, but hear me out. I would argue that this is one of the reasons it's important to keep certain ideas out, because if we let microtransactions become a part of the hobby, which it absolutely will, if we, like it has with video games, DLC and microtransactions in video games have become normalized because we didn't say no as a customer base. We didn't say no. And so if we sit back, and let me finish, and then I'll give you back the mic. But if we don't say no now and gatekeep this idea out of the hobby, I think it's gonna be in for some rough times.
Well, I wouldn't view it as gatekeeping. I would view it as customer feedback to a company, but it's a little bit different than gatekeeping, in my opinion. I see where you got there. I disagreeing with the definition.
Fair enough. As long as you're with me and the overall idea, I don't care what word you use to describe it.
Yeah.
There you go. But I think WotC has shown that they will listen, right? If enough people band together to kind of say, look, this is the way we want to see it. They certainly did last year with the OGL. And I think if microtransactions show up, I think people are going to flock out of their system into other VTTs. And one of the things that somebody brought up to me once was, well, yeah, but then what if the only way you can get their books is on their VTT and I can't have it on the other one? okay, you order the print book and do it with a Zoom, do it with a StreamYard meeting and DD Dice, right? You don't necessarily need a virtual tabletop to go look stuff up on. You can use the book and just sort of do it verbally like we all do. So I think that's an interesting place for us to leave it. I didn't want to go longer than an hour because I know Harmony's got another thing she's on tonight.
Like 3 hours, 2 hours.
Yeah, but I have 3 kids I have to feed.
Oh yeah, okay. So
Trying to throw Ginger under the bus there.
I
Right.
would never do that because
I see.
one of the things I learned very early on in life is you always treat you always treat everybody. So 2 interesting things I learned in my military career. One is there's a saying for absolutely everything. And one of my favorite sayings I learned sort of day 3 was every one of you here has my respect. It is your birthright. God help those of you who lose it. That was number 1. And number 2 was never make a redhead mad. So I learned that the hard way once. It turned out
I used to be a redhead. Or at least
I would be
partial.
careful. I'll be careful not to ever make you
Wow.
angry.
I identify as a redhead, so internally, spiritually.
Yeah.
I'm just happy to identify as somebody who's still 6 feet over instead of 6 feet under. And the older I get, the more I love that every day. But anyway, I think we'll leave it there. But thank you guys for coming on. I think this has been kind of an interesting conversation. And it's my first live stream I've ever done. I think we had 20 or 21 people at one point. So I might have to do another one of these sooner or later. But next time something comes up that I feel like I'll be certainly give you guys a call again. But I'm sure we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thank
All right.
you.
Everybody have a
Nice to
good
meet
one.
y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Always a good time.